My name is Richard. I'm 67, and last Christmas, I watched my daughter pour every ounce of herself into making a perfect holiday decorating cooking. Smiling through the strain while her husband was posting pictures from Hawaii like he had no family waiting at home. I told myself to let it go, that we could still hold the night together. But as the guests gathered and the wine was poured, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. In that moment, I realized Christmas would not end the way any of us imagined. What happened next left everyone in the room speechless. And if you stay with me, I promise you will want to hear every word. The December air was sharp that evening, the kind that makes you pull your coat tighter even if the walk from the driveway to the front porch is only a few steps. Inside the house smelled of pine and cinnamon, the Christmas tree standing proudly in the corner of the living room with its twinkling lights glowing against the window. Emily had worked herself half to death, getting it all just right. She wanted the night to be perfect, the kind of holiday her children would remember when they were grown, the kind of gathering that held a family together, even when cracks were starting to show. I watched her move through the kitchen in a flurry. Her cheeks flushed from the oven, heat her hair pinned back loosely as she basted the turkey one more time. She glanced up at me when she noticed me leaning against the doorway, her eyes tired but shining with a kind of determination I had always admired. She was 35 now, a mother of 2, a teacher who still carried papers home to grade after the kids were asleep. And yet here she was, balancing trays of roasted vegetables and homemade pies, still humming softly to herself to keep from feeling overwhelmed. "Dad, could you grab the napkins from the cabinet?" she asked without looking up, "and maybe set the table if you have time." I moved quickly to do it. I wanted to help in any way I could, though I knew she would shoulder most of it regardless. That was who Emily was. She wanted to be the glue, the one who held everyone together. Sometimes I feared it would break her. The table stretched across the dining room, covered in a cloth embroidered with holly leaves that had belonged to my late wife. Each place setting had a name card, Emily's careful handwriting marking where everyone should sit. She had polished the silver herself, and the glasses sparkled in the light. I laid the napkins out, folding them the way her mother used to fold them, remembering how my wife would have loved to see Emily take such pride in creating something warm and welcoming. From the kitchen, I heard the sound of the mixer and then the sudden silence when she turned it off. She stepped into the doorway, holding a bowl of mashed potatoes, her expression tightening for just a second before she forced another smile. She didn't have to say it. I already knew what weighed on her. Mark was not here. Her husband, my son-in-law, had chosen to spend the week in Hawaii. He had called it a business trip, but anyone with sense could see it was more about pleasure. Pictures had made their way onto social media. Him in sunglasses, him holding drinks with umbrellas, him on a boat with the ocean glittering behind him. All while Emily stayed behind juggling lesson plans, kids, and this dinner. I carried the bowl from her hands and set it on the sideboard. She let out a breath as though the weight of it had been heavier than it was. "Are the kids ready?" I asked gently. "Upstairs," she said, changing into their sweaters. "They're excited." She gave a little laugh that caught in her throat. "They think their dad will walk through the door at any minute." I didn't have the heart to tell them not to expect it. Neither did I. I wanted them to hold on to whatever hope they could for as long as possible. Childhood only lasts so long. She moved past me again this time, with a tray of cookies decorated in red and green icing. Her hands trembled just a little as she set them down, and I saw her pause, steadying herself. She was carrying too much, not just plates and pans, but the invisible weight of disappointment. It showed in the way her shoulders slumped when she thought no one was watching. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, or maybe it was only in my ears. Guests would be arriving soon. Friends, neighbors, and family who believed tonight was about celebration. Emily would greet them with her smile, with glasses of wine and plates of appetizers hiding the truth of her husband's absence. She wanted everyone to feel at home, to feel as if nothing were wrong. I admired her strength, but it cut at me too. She shouldn't have to cover for him. I walked back to the living room and adjusted the lights on the tree, letting my hand rest on an ornament Emily had made in second grade. Her photograph inside a cardboard frame, dusted with glitter. I remembered hanging it each year with her mother, both of us marveling at how quickly she was growing. Now she was a woman, and I was proud of her. But I hated the thought that her marriage was stealing the joy she deserved. Through the window, I saw the first car pull into the driveway. Martha Patterson and her husband, old friends from next door, carrying a bottle of wine and a plate of something covered in foil. I opened the door for them, the cold rushing in, and Martha hugged me tight, her perfume mingling with the scent of winter air. "Merry Christmas, Richard," she said warmly. "The house looks beautiful. Emily has really outdone herself." I smiled, though my chest tightened. Yes, she has. As more cars arrived, the rooms filled with voices and laughter. The children darted down the stairs, their sweaters bright with reindeer and snowflakes, their eyes wide as they ran to greet the neighbors. Emily smoothed her apron and went to meet everyone. Her smile convincing her energy, a performance that fooled almost all of them. But I knew her too well. Beneath it all, her heart was breaking a little. I moved through the crowd, refilling glasses, offering appetizers, keeping an eye on her. I saw how she glanced at the door each time it opened, as if she still expected Mark to appear. My jaw tightened, and I forced myself not to say anything. This was her night. I would not let anger steal it from her. The turkey came out of the oven, golden brown, the smell filling the house and drawing applause from the guests. Emily beamed, cheeks pink from the heat, her eyes shining with both pride and exhaustion. She looked at me across the room, and I gave her a nod, the kind a father gives when words aren't enough. She straightened her shoulders, as if that simple gesture had given her the strength to carry on. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood near the window for a moment, watching snow begin to drift down against the dark sky. It should have felt perfect, a postcard kind of Christmas, but something gnawed at me. The empty space beside Emily at the table, the way she tried not to look at it, the way the children still whispered about their father coming home soon. It was a silence no laughter could cover. And though no one else seemed to notice yet, I knew before the night was over that silence would grow louder than any carol. The doorbell rang again, and Emily wiped her hands on her apron before hurrying across the room. Her smile froze for just a beat when she saw who it was. Then she opened the door wide. Mark stepped inside, snowflakes clinging to the shoulders of his dark coat, a polished suitcase rolling behind him. He looked tanned, his hair a little longer than when he had left. And in his hand he carried a glossy shopping bag, stamped with the name of a luxury store from Honolulu. "Dad, look who finally made it," Emily called out, her voice tight with something I could not quite place. The children squealed and ran toward him, wrapping their arms around his legs, their excitement so pure it almost hurt to watch. Mark crouched down, lifting them into his arms, kissing their cheeks as if he had not just spent a week on a beach while their mother wore herself out here at home. He straightened and met my eyes across the room. His smile was wide, practiced, the kind that belonged on a salesman, more than a husband or father. "Richard," he said warmly. "Merry Christmas. I just made it in time." I nodded, forcing civility into my expression. "You did." He placed the shopping bag on the entry table, pulling out a box wrapped in gold paper. "For the kids," he announced, handing it to them with a flourish. Then he retrieved a smaller velvet bag and held it out to Emily. She took it hesitantly, untying the ribbon to reveal a delicate necklace with a tiny diamond pendant. She blinked back tears, but whether from gratitude or exhaustion, I could not tell. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "Of course I did," he said, slipping an arm around her shoulders and pressing a kiss against her hair. "My girl deserves to shine." The guests murmured polite approval, though I noticed Martha raise her eyebrows at me. She, like me, had seen the photographs online. She knew what kind of shine Mark had been enjoying in Hawaii. George and Linda followed him, in both carrying dishes covered in foil. Linda's face lit up when she saw her son. She went straight to him, fussing over his scarf and hair like he was still 10 years old. George offered a more subdued greeting, patting him on the shoulder, but watching him closely. The room filled again with chatter glasses clinking as more wine was poured. Emily disappeared back into the kitchen necklace, glinting under the light, her back a little straighter now, as if she had decided she could manage this performance for the rest of the night. I joined her a few minutes later, taking the carving knife from her hand. "Let me do that," I said. She hesitated, then let out a breath and nodded. She leaned against the counter, arms folded. "He made it," she said softly. "The kids are happy. That's all that matters tonight." I kept my eyes on the turkey as I cut into it, the skin crisp, the juices running clear. "Does it matter to you, Emily?" Her lips pressed together, and for a long moment she did not answer. Then she whispered, "It has to. Otherwise, all this would break me." We carried the platters out together, setting them on the long table. Mark was in the center of the room, telling a story about his flight being delayed, how he had charmed the airline staff to get an upgrade, how he had rushed through the snow just to be here on time. Everyone laughed in the right places, though I noticed how George's eyes narrowed when his son described ordering champagne mid-flight. The children tugged at their father's sleeve, begging him to sit with them. He ruffled their hair, promising he would. But first he moved to pour himself a drink at the bar. I watched as he filled his glass nearly to the brim, tossing half of it back in one swallow. He smacked his lips and smiled broadly. "Nothing like a good whiskey to take the chill off," he said. Dinner began. Plates passed down the table. The sound of forks against china mixing with the strains of carols playing softly from the speaker. For a while the room held the kind of warmth Emily had worked so hard to create. Guests complimented the food, praised the decorations, admired the children's sweaters. Emily glowed under their words, her cheeks pink, her smile genuine for the first time all evening. Then Mark cleared his throat, raising his glass. "To family," he said loudly, "and to new beginnings." He glanced around the table, his gaze landing on me for just a beat too long. I lifted my own glass politely, though my stomach tightened. "So, tell us," Mark Frank asked from across the table, "what kind of business brings you all the way to Hawaii at Christmas?" Mark leaned back, grinning as if he had been waiting for the question. "Oh, just a few opportunities I have been exploring. Networking, potential investors, that sort of thing. You know how it is, always chasing the next big thing." "Networking on the beach," Martha murmured, just loud enough for me to hear. Emily stiffened beside him, but Mark launched into a long description of luxury hotels, fine dining, and conversations he claimed were full of promise. I watched the faces around the table. Some nodded polite, but others exchanged subtle looks of doubt. George's jaw tightened, and Linda, oblivious, clapped her hands together as if her son were already a millionaire. The kids whispered to each other, giggling as they showed their grandmother the little toys they had unwrapped earlier. For a moment, the noise of their joy covered the heaviness in the air. But it was there, waiting just under the surface. When Mark finally paused for breath, Emily spoke quietly, her fork poised above her plate. "The rent is due next week," she said. Her voice was calm, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the fork. "We still need to cover the electricity and the kids' after-school fees." The table went silent. Mark's smile froze, then stretched wider. "Of course, sweetheart," he said smoothly. "That's all handled. You don't need to worry." "Handled," she repeated, and the way she said it made my chest ache. I set down my glass, meeting Mark's eyes across the candles flickering on the table. "You should be the one making sure she never has to say those words at all," I said evenly. Mark's expression hardened, though he quickly covered it with another laugh. "Come on, Richard, no need to make it heavy. It's Christmas." But the words hung there weighty and unshakable. Emily looked down at her plate, blinking fast, while the children poked at their mashed potatoes, sensing the tension, even if they did not understand it. Linda cleared her throat, forcing a smile. "Let's not spoil the evening," she said brightly. "Everything tastes wonderful." The conversation shifted with effort, but the undercurrent remained. I chewed slowly, my mind turning over the look in Mark's eyes, the too smooth explanations, the quick drink he had taken upon arrival. I had a feeling the night was just beginning to reveal its cracks, and the silence I had feared was still waiting for us, heavier than before. Martha leaned closer to me, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "You can always tell when someone is trying too hard." I followed her eyes across the table to where Mark was gesturing wildly, telling Frank and Dr. Hill about his adventures at a luau, the roasted pig, the dancers, the endless cocktails. His laugh was just a little too loud. His hand motions too wide, and every detail seemed polished, like a rehearsed monologue. Emily smiled politely at his side, nodding when people glanced at her, though her eyes stayed on her plate. She had barely eaten a bite, her fork moving food around more than lifting it. I wanted to reach for her hand to squeeze it, but I knew she would only pull away, not out of anger, but because she would not want to draw attention to herself. The children had grown restless, sliding off their chairs and running toward the living room. The sound of their laughter drifted back as they played with their new toys under the tree. That at least was genuine joy, untouched by the tension sitting heavy over the dining table. Mark raised his glass again. "You know, Hawaii taught me something," he said, grinning. "Life is meant to be lived big. You cannot play it safe forever. You have to take risks if you want to win." Martha's husband, Harold, cleared his throat. "Risks are one thing, son, but responsibility is another." The table stilled again. Mark chuckled, brushing the comment aside, and launched into another story, this time about scuba diving and how he was going to invest in some kind of travel startup with a man he met on the beach. Dr. Hill smiled politely, but I saw her eyes flicker with doubt. Frank shifted uncomfortably, sipping his wine instead of responding. George sat very still at the far end of the table, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on his son with something between disappointment and weariness. Linda, as always, beamed with pride, nodding at every word as if Mark were delivering a victory speech. The noise of forks and glasses picked up again, conversations breaking off into smaller groups to ease the heaviness. I excused myself and went into the kitchen under the pretense of fetching another bottle of wine. Emily followed me, her apron strings dragging across the floor. "He is telling them what they want to hear," she said softly, her hands pressed flat against the counter. "And they are pretending to believe it, because it is easier than the truth." I set the bottle down and looked at her. "And what do you believe?" She met my eyes, and for a moment the mask slipped. "I believe I am holding everything together with tape and thread, and I am terrified it will all unravel before the night is over." Her voice trembled, but she straightened quickly when Linda appeared in the doorway carrying empty plates. Linda smiled at both of us. "That boy of mine," she said fondly. "Always such a charmer. You must be so proud, Richard." I forced a polite nod and watched her walk back into the dining room. Emily exhaled shakily. I put a hand on her shoulder. "Stay strong for now," I whispered. "The night is long, but you are not alone in it." We carried the wine and fresh plates back in. The children came running up begging for dessert. Emily excused herself to slice the pies, and the guests followed her with their eyes offering praise again for how wonderful everything was. I saw her shoulders stiffen under the weight of it. Mark leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink. "To my amazing wife," he said loudly, "for making this night unforgettable." He raised his glass, and everyone followed, though a few glances darted between him and me. His words were sweet, but his tone rang false. Emily smiled faintly, then disappeared into the kitchen again. As dessert was served, the conversations grew lighter, but I could not shake the unease curling in my stomach. Mark had drunk steadily since he arrived. His cheeks flushed, his stories more extravagant with each refill. He seemed desperate to keep the spotlight on himself, to drown out the silence that tried to seep back into the room. Martha caught my eye once more. She tilted her head toward Mark, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She did not need to say it. I knew she felt the same crack in the evening that I did. George finally spoke up, his voice steady but heavy. "Mark, maybe it is time you let others talk." He lifted his glass but did not drink. "Some of us came here to enjoy a family Christmas, not to hear about cocktails on the beach." Mark froze, his grin faltering. Then he forced another laugh, clapping his father on the back. "Always keeping me grounded, Dad. You know me, though. I like to dream big." But the lightness in his voice did not reach his eyes. I watched him closely, the way his hand tightened around the stem of his glass, the way his jaw ticked before he leaned back again. The children ran through the dining room with sparklers Emily had saved from the 4th of July, their giggles filling the air. Everyone laughed, grateful for the distraction. The tension eased for a moment, but I knew it would return. I could see it in the way Emily's smile did not quite reach her eyes when she carried out the whipped cream for the pies. I could feel it in the silence that hovered just under the laughter, waiting for its chance to surface again. I finished my slice of pie and set my fork down, listening to the hum of voices around me. The night was far from over, and though the tree lights sparkled and the carols played softly, the weight of what lay ahead pressed against my chest. Something in the air told me we had not yet seen the worst of it. Mark leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his glass of wine half empty and his voice pitched just a little louder than necessary. "You know what I keep telling Emily," he said, "is that we are sitting on opportunities no one else has the courage to take." He tapped the table with his finger, looking from guest to guest as though he were pitching a business plan. "I met a guy in Hawaii, real sharp, already making moves in the travel sector. With the right backing, we could double our money in less than a year." Emily froze with the serving spoon still in her hand. She tried to smile, but it wavered when she realized all eyes had shifted to her. "Dad, maybe we can talk about this later," she said quietly, as though her voice could wrap a blanket over the moment. But Mark pressed on, gesturing toward me. "Richard, you've always been smart with money. You know it takes risk to build anything worthwhile. A small investment, that's all it would take." My jaw tightened. I set down my fork and met his eyes. "What it takes, Mark, is discipline. What it takes is showing up for your wife and children before you start chasing big payoffs that may or may not exist." A hush fell around the table. Emily lowered her gaze, her knuckles white around the spoon. I could hear the faint sound of the children laughing in the other room, blissfully unaware of the weight pressing on their mother's shoulders. Mark's smile cracked, then stretched wider, forced. "Come on, it's Christmas," he said, lifting his glass. "No need to be heavy." Emily spoke again, softer this time, but her words cut through. "We are already behind on bills. We can't afford another one of your ideas." I saw Martha's head turn, her eyes narrowing, and Frank leaned back in his chair with a sigh. Dr. Hill glanced at Emily with sympathy, while Linda blinked as though she had misheard. Mark laughed, but it sounded brittle. "Everything is handled, sweetheart. I told you that." "Handled," Emily repeated, her voice trembling. Then she set the spoon down and sat folding her hands in her lap. She looked as if she had just given up a fight she had been carrying on alone for far too long. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I kept my tone steady. "You should be the one making sure she never has to worry about rent or utilities, Mark. That is not her burden to carry." George's voice came from the end of the table, quiet but firm. "Your father-in-law is right. A man should not leave his wife to bear the weight of a household while he plays at business." Mark turned sharply toward his father. Thanks for the support, Dad. I can always count on you to humiliate me in front of everyone. George's face reddened, but he held his ground. If telling the truth humiliates you, that's on you. Linda reached out quickly, touching George's arm. Please, not tonight, she whispered, her eyes darting nervously around the table. The room was thick with silence, the only sound the faint clatter of a fork falling onto a plate. Emily dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, pretending it was only the heat from the kitchen making them water. Mark leaned back with a heavy sigh, spreading his arms as if to draw the air back into the room. Look, maybe I get carried away, he said, his voice suddenly smooth again. Maybe I dream too big. But someone has to write. No one answered. He raised his glass again in a hollow toast, then drained it in one swallow. I sat there watching Emily shrink into herself, her shoulders curving forward as if she were trying to disappear. My heart ached for her. This was the girl who once ran across the yard in bare feet chasing fireflies, her laughter ringing through the summer night. Now she sat across from me, burdened by a man who mistook selfishness for ambition. The children came bursting back into the room, holding their new toys high and begging us to come see their fort under the tree. Their joy lifted the tension for a moment, and the guests followed them with smiles, grateful for the reprieve. Emily rose quickly, gathering plates, her back turned to us as she carried them into the kitchen. I followed a moment later, finding her at the sink with her hands braced against the counter, her head bowed. I touched her shoulder gently. You do not have to carry this alone, I said. She shook her head. If I let go, it all falls apart. Her voice was small, and I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that I would catch everything before it hit the floor. But she straightened again, plastering a smile onto her face before walking back out with a tray of desserts. She was determined to finish what she had started, no matter how much it cost her. I stayed behind, a moment staring at the quiet kitchen. The sound of laughter drifted from the living room, the children's voices bright. But under it, I heard something else, the steady rhythm of a house straining under secrets, ready to crack if pushed any harder. The sound of chairs shifting carried from the dining room, voices rising in uneven waves. When I stepped back in, Linda was already speaking, her tone sharp with defense. Richard is being too hard on him, she insisted, her eyes darting from me to George. Mark has always had ideas, always reached higher than most people dare. That is something to be proud of. George sat stiffly at the end of the table, his hands folded, his gaze steady. Reaching higher is not the same as shirking responsibility, he said quietly. You know it, Linda. Linda's lips pressed tight, her cheeks flushed, but she turned toward the guests as though appealing for allies. He has ambition, she said, almost pleading now. Isn't that better than settling for an ordinary life? Martha raised her eyebrows, but it was Frank who answered first. Ambition means nothing if your family pays the price, he said, his voice measured. Everyone's eyes turned to him, his words hanging heavier than the garland draped across the mantel. Emily reappeared from the kitchen carrying a tray of pies, her face pale though her smile stayed fixed. She set the tray down and began slicing quickly, as if moving fast enough could erase the sharp edges of the conversation. Mark chuckled, the sound forced. You all act like I've dragged Emily into ruin. We are fine. Everything is under control. I caught Martha's eye from across the table. She tilted her head slightly, her expression telling me she was not fooled either. George finally pushed back his chair, the legs scraping against the hardwood. Mark, I've sat quietly most of the night, but I cannot pretend anymore. You drink too much, you waste money we don't have, and you let your wife work herself sick while you chase schemes that never add up. That is not ambition. That is neglect. Mark's smile faltered, then twisted. You of all people should understand, Dad. You spent your life teaching for a paycheck that barely kept us above water. I am not going to die small like that. Linda gasped. George's face darkened, but before he could speak, Emily's voice cracked through the tension. Enough. Her hands trembled as she placed a slice of pie on a plate. Please, just eat. Please. Her plea quieted the room, but the silence felt worse than the shouting. Guests shifted in their chairs, avoiding each other's eyes. I saw one of the children peeking from the living room doorway, wide-eyed, sensing too much. I gestured gently, and they disappeared back toward the tree. The scrape of footsteps drew my attention. Out on the porch, through the frosted window, I glimpsed Mark slipping outside with his phone pressed to his ear. His shoulders were hunched, his voice low but urgent. Nathan, seated near me, leaned slightly, catching fragments through the glass when Mark turned just enough. If I don't get it by the end of the month, I am finished. I swear I will. No, tonight is my chance. Nathan's brow furrowed, his eyes meeting mine for a split second. Neither of us spoke, but we understood. Inside, Linda filled the silence with a brittle laugh. Families fight. That is what makes us strong. She raised her glass, but only a few joined her. The rest kept glancing at the porch, where Mark's shadow moved back and forth, his hand slicing the air as he argued. When he came back in, his grin was wide again, too wide. Sorry about that, he said smoothly. Some business I could not ignore. But now I am all yours. George shook his head slowly. Even on Christmas, he murmured. Mark ignored him, dropping back into his seat and slapping the table as if to jolt the mood back to life. Who is ready for a toast? No one answered. Emily cut another slice of pie, her eyes fixed on the plate so she would not have to look at anyone else. I watched her fingers tremble as she set the fork down, and my chest tightened with a mix of anger and sorrow. The conversation stumbled back into motion, guests trying to smooth the edges, asking about recipes, complimenting the decorations, anything to steer away from the raw wound in the center of the table. But beneath it all, I felt the ground shift. Lines were being drawn, loyalties tested, and the night was far from over. The sound of wrapping paper crinkling filled the living room as the children dragged their new toys toward the couch, begging the adults to watch them build forts out of boxes. Emily followed with a tray, her smile faint, but practiced as she set out slices of pie topped with whipped cream. The sweet smell should have softened the room, but tension clung to the air like smoke. Mark rose from his chair with an exaggerated flourish. I have something special, he announced, walking toward the sideboard where he had set down his glossy shopping bag from Hawaii. He pulled out a long, slender box and held it up for everyone to see. I thought it would be the perfect gift for the man of the house. He walked around the table, stopping in front of me. Inside was a bottle of rum, dark and heavy, its label, gold embossed with Hawaiian lettering. For you, Richard, he said, bowing slightly as if he were presenting treasure. Only the best for my father-in-law. Polite murmurs went around the table. But I could feel eyes watching closely, trying to measure whether this was generosity or a performance. I took the bottle and turned it in my hands. It was expensive, no doubt, but it sat wrong in my palms, like an offering meant to distract from something else. Emily cleared her throat. Dad, why don't you save that for another night? We still have wine open. Mark's grin widened, though his eyes flicked quickly toward her. Oh, but this is no ordinary bottle, he said. It deserves a proper toast. He pulled another box from the bag, this one smaller, wrapped in silver paper, and handed it to me. Inside lay 2 crystal glasses, the kind you bring out only for the grandest of occasions. The guests clapped politely, though Martha exchanged a glance with her husband that spoke volumes. Emily forced a smile and began passing out plates of pie. Her hands moving quickly, her lips pressed tight. Mark uncorked the bottle with a flourish, the sharp pop echoing louder than it should have. He poured a generous measure into one of the new glasses, the amber liquid catching the light. With the second glass, he turned deliberately toward me, filling it nearly to the brim. To Richard, he declared for raising such a wonderful daughter and for welcoming me into this family. The words should have been touching, but his tone was slick, rehearsed. He lifted his own glass high, waiting for me to join him. I held the glass, but did not drink. "Thank you," I said evenly. "Your words mean more than you know." Emily stepped between us with another plate of pie. "Let's eat first," she said quickly. "The kids are waiting for dessert." Her voice carried a sharp edge, though she softened it with a smile at the guests. Mark lowered his glass, but his grin never wavered. "Of course," he said smoothly, setting it down on the sideboard. "There is time for everything tonight." The chatter resumed in fits and starts. Frank complimented the crust of the pie, and Dr. Hill began asking Emily about her school year, drawing the attention back to safer ground. Still, I could feel the undercurrent, the way everyone's eyes kept sliding toward Mark, waiting to see what he would do next. Linda leaned over to me, her voice hushed, but insistent. "He is trying, Richard. Can't you see that? He brought you gifts. He came home. He is making an effort." I looked at her steadily. Gifts are easy. Effort is showing up when no one is watching. Her smile faltered, and she turned quickly back to her pie. George, sitting on her other side, gave me a single nod, his lips pressed thin. The children began tugging on Emily's sleeve, begging her to come see their fort. She followed them into the living room, her laughter carrying faintly as she admired their creation. For a moment, the house sounded like it should on Christmas night, filled with simple joy. Mark rose again, topping off his drink. He moved among the guests, leaning too close, telling stories that grew bigger with each sip. He spoke of investors in New York, of plans to open a chain of luxury rental properties, of a future so bright it bordered on fantasy. Some nodded politely, but most let their eyes wander. I stayed quiet, watching, waiting. The rum sat heavy in my glass, untouched. The tree lights blinked steadily in the corner, casting their glow over faces that tried to appear cheerful. But beneath it all, I could feel the weight of something darker, settling in a shadow stretching across the evening that no amount of laughter could quite chase away. Martha touched my arm as she passed by with a plate in her hand. Her eyes held mine for a moment, then flicked toward Mark, who was leaning too close to Dr. Hill, spinning another story about his week in paradise. She shook her head slightly and moved on without a word. I understood what she meant. He was talking too much, too fast, as though he could drown the truth beneath a flood of details. I slipped into the kitchen, needing a moment away from the noise. Emily was at the counter with her back to me, her hands braced on either side of the sink. The necklace Mark had given her glinted under the overhead light. It was lovely, but it looked like a chain around her neck. She lifted her head when she heard me. "Dad," she whispered, "do you think people can change?" Her voice was so small, I almost did not hear it. I stepped closer. "People can," I said carefully, "but only if they want to." She gave a short laugh that sounded nothing like joy. "That is what I thought." She opened the cabinet, pulled down the coffee tin, and busied herself with measuring out grounds, as though keeping her hands moving could keep her from falling apart. The door creaked, and I caught sight of movement. Mark stood in the doorway, a faint smirk on his lips. "There you are," he said, his tone too light. "Plotting against me in the kitchen, huh?" Emily's shoulders stiffened. She kept her eyes on the coffee pot. I moved to the sideboard to fetch another stack of plates. As I did, I noticed Mark's hand slipping into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small packet. He caught sight of me watching and froze for half a second before shoving it back down. His smile tightened, then he clapped me on the shoulder. "Come on, Richard, join me for one more drink. I have a toast planned." I stared at him, my heart beating harder. I wanted to demand he show me what was in his pocket. But Emily was right there, pale and tired, and I could not pile another fight onto her. Not yet. Back in the dining room, the guests were laughing at something George had said, grateful for his calm humor. Mark raised his glass high, drawing attention back to himself. To family, he declared again, and to the future, we build together. Emily set down the coffee pot, poured a cup for George, and slipped quietly into a chair. Her face was unreadable, her body still. I could feel the strain rolling off her like heat. Later, when most of the pie was gone and conversation had settled into smaller clusters, Martha leaned close to me. "I need to tell you something," she said softly. "I saw him. In Hawaii, not alone." I turned to her sharply. She nodded. "A friend of mine was there last week. Sent me a picture, and I recognized him instantly. He was with a younger woman, not a business partner." She let the words hang. The room suddenly felt colder. I pressed my hand against the table, steadying myself. So that was it? The business trip, the grand promises, all just another lie. As if on cue, Emily appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray of cookies for the children. She smiled faintly, but when her eyes met mine, I knew she saw the truth already. She set the tray down and brushed past Mark without a word. He reached for her elbow, but she pulled free, her face still composed, her body taut with silent strength. Mark's eyes followed her, his smile faltering, then snapping back into place as he turned toward the guests again. He laughed too loudly at one of Frank's jokes, his voice cracking for just a second before smoothing over. I could not take my eyes off that jacket pocket. The outline of the packet bulged faintly against the fabric. I told myself I must be imagining it, that no one would dare something so reckless in the middle of a Christmas gathering. But the thought clung to me, a whisper I could not shake. Emily reappeared, gathering empty glasses. She moved slowly, carefully, as though the weight of every step pressed down on her shoulders. She paused near me, setting down a plate, her lips barely moving. "He is hiding something, Dad. I know it." Her words chilled me more than the snow outside. I wanted to take her hand, to tell her we would figure it out together. But before I could speak, Mark clapped his hands loudly. "Time for presents," he announced, his grin wide. He bent to reach under the tree, pulling out brightly wrapped boxes for the children. Their squeals of delight masked the uneasy glances darting around the room. I watched him move, so smooth, so practiced, and felt a knot tighten in my chest. There was something in that pocket, something he did not want anyone to see. And sooner or later, I was going to find out exactly what it was. The guests were still gathered around the dining table, forks clinking lightly against plates as the last bites of pie disappeared. But my attention kept drifting to Mark. He had planted himself near the sideboard again, one hand resting casually on the glossy bottle of rum as if it were a prize he had won. He kept talking, his voice rising above the softer tones around him, each story more exaggerated than the last. I watched his movements closely, noting the way his fingers brushed his jacket pocket, a quick and nervous gesture that betrayed the confidence in his smile. Emily returned from the kitchen with fresh napkins, her steps careful, her face composed. She moved around the table, refilling coffee cups, smoothing over the cracks in conversation. She glanced at me, once her eyes flicking quickly toward Mark and back again, as though she could not bear to linger. I read the fear there, though she never spoke it aloud. Mark tapped the rim of his glass against the bottle, drawing everyone's attention. "Time for something special," he announced, his grin broad and fixed. He reached into the glossy bag again and produced the crystal glasses he had given me earlier. The chandelier light caught them, scattering sharp little sparks across the tablecloth. He set them down with a flourish and began to pour. The liquid caught the light, dark and golden, sliding smoothly into each glass. The room quieted, as if some unspoken tension had hushed the laughter. I saw it then, a subtle flick of his wrist, his other hand sliding into his pocket. When it came out, his palm hovered over one glass, just a fraction too long, his body angled toward me so no one else could quite see. I caught the faintest haze as a fine powder fell and dissolved into the drink. He stirred it against the rim with practiced ease, disguising it as a casual swirl. My stomach tightened. I forced my face neutral, though my fingers gripped the edge of the table. When he turned, the glass he had tampered with was already extended toward me. "For you, Richard," he said warmly, though his eyes held a glint that unsettled me. The man who built a family worth toasting. The guests lifted their heads, glancing between us. Emily froze halfway across the room, a plate of cookies in her hands, her eyes fixed on that glass. George frowned, his gaze narrowing, while Linda's smile grew brighter, as if she had no doubt her son was making a generous gesture. I reached out, feeling the cool weight of the crystal in my hand. "Thank you, Mark," I said evenly, forcing calm into my voice. "That is generous." Mark raised his own glass high. "To Richard," he declared, "and to the future this family deserves." Around the table, glasses lifted, though the movement was uneven. Martha's lips pressed thin as she raised hers, her eyes flicking toward me with quiet warning. Frank cleared his throat before joining in, while Dr. Hill only sipped at her coffee. The children's voices drifted from the living room, their laughter a distant reminder of innocence, untouched by any of this. I brought the glass near my lips, but did not drink. The liquid shimmered under the light, smooth and enticing, but I let it hover untouched. "Perhaps we should wait," I said calmly. "The children have not finished opening their gifts, and it seems better to toast together when everyone is settled." A murmur of agreement moved around the table, guests grateful for the reprieve. Emily exhaled softly, though she masked it with a smile as she set down the cookies. Mark hesitated, then forced another grin. Of course, no rush." He set his glass down, but I noticed how his eyes darted back to mine, sharp and watchful. I excused myself under the pretense of checking on the children. In the kitchen, I found Emily standing by the counter, her hands gripping the edge so tightly, her knuckles whitened. "He did something to that glass," she whispered without turning. "I saw it too." I moved closer, lowering my voice. "I know. Do not touch it. Whatever happens, keep the children close." Her breath shook, but she nodded quickly. She pulled herself upright again, smoothed her hair, and carried another tray back into the dining room, her smile firmly in place. I lingered behind a moment, my mind racing. My instincts told me the powder was no harmless addition. Mark's debts. The urgency in his voice on that phone call, his grand gestures tonight, all of it pointed to desperation. Desperate men do dangerous things. When I stepped back into the dining room, the atmosphere had shifted again. Conversation stumbled along in fragmented lines, guests trying to pretend nothing was wrong. Mark sat in the center of it all, laughing too loudly, leaning too close to Dr. Hill, waving his glass in wide arcs as he spoke of investors and opportunities. His words carried the cadence of a pitch, not a story, each detail polished, each promise inflated. George remained quiet at the end of the table, his expression grim. Linda kept smiling, nodding at everything her son said, clinging to the image of the boy she had raised, not the man before her. Martha whispered to her husband, their faces tight with unease. I moved toward the sideboard where the glass sat untouched. Its surface looked smooth now, no trace of what I had seen, but my chest tightened at the memory. I forced myself to step back, unwilling to give Mark the satisfaction of seeing me hesitate. The children burst into the room again, waving their toys and begging Emily to see the fort they had built under the tree. She followed them with quick steps, grateful for the distraction. Their laughter filled the room, spilling against the heavy silence like sunlight through a crack in storm clouds. Mark used the moment to refill his glass again. He drank quickly, then set it down with a thud. "So, Richard," he said, his voice too smooth, "do you believe in second chances?" The question hung heavy in the air, but I did not answer. I only held his gaze steady and unyielding while the house around us hummed with both celebration and unease. I knew then that this night was far from finished, and whatever Mark had planned, he had only just begun to play his hand. The children's laughter swirled through the living room as they darted between the tree and the couch, their paper crowns slipping sideways from too much giggling. The guests clapped politely, grateful for something light to focus on. But my eyes never left the sideboard, where that glass still sat waiting. Mark followed my gaze once, then quickly turned his smile back to the others, talking too fast about plans no one believed. I moved closer to the hearth, leaning on the mantel, as if studying the stockings Emily had hung. In truth, I was watching the room from a different angle. The light from the fire cast shadows across faces already drawn tight with unease. George kept his eyes lowered, his fork pushed back on his plate untouched. Linda fussed with napkins and silverware, her smile stretched thin, pretending not to notice her husband's silence. Martha whispered to Frank, their heads bent close, and Dr. Hill sipped coffee without lifting her gaze. Emily reappeared with another tray, this time carrying mugs of hot cider for the children. Her voice was soft, her smile determined, but her hands trembled as she set each cup down. When she glanced at me, her eyes were asking what I already knew. The danger had not passed. Mark rose, suddenly clapping his hands. "All right, let's make this memorable," he said, his grin wide as he moved toward the sideboard again. The timing was perfect. The children had just gathered in front of the tree, and most eyes were on them, not on him. He lifted my glass from the sideboard and held it aloft, moving toward me, with the smoothness of a practiced gesture. I felt the knot tighten in my chest. Guests looked up as he stopped in front of me, presenting it like a challenge. "To Richard," he said loudly, "for showing us all what strength looks like." His tone was syrupy, but I caught the flicker in his gaze, the glint of something harsher beneath the polish. The room hushed. I took the glass slowly, feeling every eye turn toward me. Emily had frozen by the doorway, her lips parted. George shifted in his seat as though about to rise, but Linda touched his arm quickly, her own face pale. I forced a small smile and raised the glass. "Thank you, Mark," I said calmly. "Your words mean more than you think." And with that, I stepped sideways past him and toward the edge of the table where George's glass sat nearly identical to mine. My heart pounded in my ears as I waited for the perfect moment. The children shrieked with laughter as one of them knocked over a stack of wrapped boxes, and all heads turned for just an instant. My hand moved in that second smooth as setting down silverware, switching the glasses without anyone noticing. When I straightened, my glass was empty in front of me, and George's hand rested near the one I had carried. My throat was tight, but I forced myself to laugh at the children's antics. That was all it took. Mark's eyes flicked toward the glass on the table, and then back to me, satisfied. He raised his own glass high again. "To family," he declared, and drained it in one swallow. George reached for his glass, slowly lifting it to his lips. My pulse leapt into my throat. The room shifted back to conversation, unaware of the trap set before us. I caught sight of Emily across the room, her eyes wide, her mouth forming the start of a word she could not say. My hand twitched at my side. The moment hung heavy, and I knew it was about to break. George's hand was halfway to his lips when my voice cut through the air sharper than I intended. "Stop!" Everyone froze. Forks clattered against plates, chairs squeaked as people shifted, and the children fell silent by the tree. George blinked confused, the glass hovering inches from his mouth. "Do not drink that," I said again, louder this time, my chest tightening as every eye in the room turned to me. The room was utterly still, the only sound the faint hum of the furnace and the crackle of the fire. Emily's face had gone pale, her hand pressed to her chest. Mark was standing near the sideboard, his grin stiff and unyielding, but his eyes darted toward me with a flash of something that looked like panic before he smoothed it over. "What are you doing, Richard?" he said with forced laughter. "You are scaring everyone. It is just a toast." I stepped closer to George, my gaze locked on the glass in his hand. "Something is in that drink," I said, my voice steady even though my pulse thundered in my ears. "I saw you at it, Mark." Gasps rippled across the table. Martha covered her mouth. Frank sat forward and Dr. Hill's brow furrowed, as if she were trying to process what she had just heard. Linda's eyes darted wildly between her husband and her son. George's hand trembled, and slowly he set the glass back on the table, without drinking. Mark chuckled again, louder this time, but the sound rang false. "This is ridiculous." He turned in a slow circle, gesturing toward the guests. "My father-in-law is mistaken. Maybe he saw me add ice, or maybe the light played tricks on him. That is all." I shook my head, my throat dry. "No, I saw it. A packet from your pocket powder into the glass. Do not lie to me, not in front of everyone." Emily's voice broke, then fragile and shaking. "I saw it too." She took a step forward, her hands twisting in her apron. He leaned over that glass. Silence fell again, heavier this time. The words hung in the air like smoke no one could breathe through. Mark's mask faltered. His eyes darted between us, then to George, then to the untouched glass. He forced another smile, but it cracked at the edges. "Fine," he said, raising his hands. "If you really think I poisoned a drink, then prove it." Dr. Hill rose from her chair, her voice steady but cool. "We could. I work in a hospital lab. It would not take long to test." Mark's face drained of color, then flushed deep red. He lunged forward suddenly, knocking the glass off the table. It shattered on the hardwood wine, and shards of crystal sprang across the floor. Guests jumped back with cries of alarm. "Oh no," Mark said quickly, bending to pick up the pieces. "I am so clumsy. Look at that ruined." Nobody moved. The only sound was the children's frightened whispers from the corner of the room. George stared at his son with horror, his lips trembling. Linda pressed both hands to her face, her shoulders shaking. "Enough," I said, my voice rising. "Enough of the lies, enough of the games. You tried to poison me, and if I had not stopped it, your own father would have been the one to drink it." Martha's eyes widened. Frank muttered something under his breath, and Dr. Hill shook her head slowly. Mark stood upright, his hands trembling slightly, though he tried to hide it. "You are making a fool of yourself," he snapped. "Nobody here believes you." But when he looked around, he saw the doubt in their faces. He saw the way George's hands clenched the edge of the table, the way Emily's tears streamed silently down her cheeks, the way Martha crossed her arms and stared. "Tell them, Dad," Mark demanded, his voice cracking. "Tell them you believe me." George's eyes glistened as he rose slowly from his chair. His voice shook, but every word landed like a stone. "I cannot. I saw enough tonight to know that my son is not the man I thought he was." Linda sobbed quietly, her shoulders collapsing inward. Mark's face twisted, anger flooding over fear. "Fine," he spat. "Believe what you want." He swept the broken pieces into a pile with one hand, his movements sharp, his breathing ragged. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. The Christmas lights blinked softly out of place in the heavy silence. I stood still, my chest heaving, my eyes never leaving him. And in that pause, with everyone frozen around the wreckage of the shattered glass, I knew the night had only shifted into something darker. Something we were all unprepared to face. Emily's sob broke the silence first. It was not loud, just a fragile sound that slipped through her fingers as she tried to cover her mouth, but it carried more weight than any accusation. She looked at Mark as if she did not recognize the man standing in front of her. Her necklace glinted in the soft glow of the tree lights, a gift that now seemed like a collar of shame. Mark's jaw tightened. He took a step toward her, his palms open, his voice honeyed but strained. "Sweetheart, don't listen to them. They are twisting everything. You know me. You know I would never hurt your father." Emily flinched and moved back, bumping against the wall. Her eyes darted to me wide and searching. I shook my head slowly. She swallowed hard and whispered, "I saw it, Mark." You leaned over his glass. The room shifted again. Gasps, murmurs, people whispering to each other. Frank set his wine down with a thud and muttered, "This is madness." Dr. Hill stood from her chair, her voice sharp. "If that glass had gone to George, we might be planning a funeral tomorrow." Mark's head snapped toward her, his face flushing. "You're all out of your minds," he shouted, his voice cracking. He turned toward his parents. "Mom, Dad, tell them. Tell them I would never do something like this." Linda's hands shook as she reached for George, but George's face was pale and drawn. His eyes locked on his son. The silence between them spoke louder than anything else. Finally, George whispered, "I wanted to believe in you. I wanted to. But tonight I saw too much." Mark's expression crumbled for a heartbeat before rage filled the cracks. He paced in a small circle, running his hands through his hair. "All of you sit here acting so righteous," he spat. "Like you've never made mistakes. Like you've never taken risks." I stepped forward, my voice steady though my heart was pounding. "There is a difference between mistakes and murder," Emily sobbed again. The children peeked from the doorway, frightened and confused, their little faces pale. Martha quickly ushered them back toward the living room, her voice gentle but firm, trying to shield them from the chaos. Nathan cleared his throat, his lawyer's calm cutting through the storm. "There's only one way to settle this." He looked directly at Mark. "If you are innocent, you won't mind handing over what's in your pocket." Mark froze. His hand twitched toward his jacket instinctively, then stopped. His eyes darted around the room, and in that hesitation, the truth was laid bare. Nathan pressed. "Show us. Empty your pockets." Mark's laugh was hollow brittle. "What, so you can all pretend you're detectives now?" "This is absurd." George's voice cut in sharper than I had ever heard from him. "Do it, son." The weight in that single word nearly broke the room. Mark's face twisted, and suddenly he moved his hand, plunging into his pocket. For a breath, everyone tensed, unsure of what he would pull free. He yanked out the crumpled packet, small and gray, the corner torn open. Powder dusted his fingers. Gasps erupted. Linda covered her face and wept openly. Emily's knees buckled, and she gripped the wall to stay upright. Mark clenched the packet in his fist, his voice rising in desperation. "This doesn't prove anything. It could be sugar salt, anything. You people are ready to condemn me without a shred of evidence." Nathan's eyes narrowed. "Then let Dr. Hill take it to her lab. She can test it by morning." Mark hesitated, then lunged toward the fireplace, his arm swinging back. But George was faster than I expected. He grabbed his son's wrist with surprising strength. "No, you won't destroy it." For a moment, father and son locked eyes, the older man's hand gripping the younger's with all the authority he had left. Mark struggled, his teeth bared, but George's voice thundered. "I raised you better than this." Mark faltered, his grip loosening just enough for Nathan to snatch the packet from his hand. Nathan held it high, his expression grim. Enough games. The room was chaos now, voices overlapping, the children crying in the other room, despite Martha's attempts to comfort them. Emily sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face, whispering over and over, "How could you?" Mark spun, his face red, his chest heaving. "You don't understand," he shouted. "I didn't have a choice. They were going to ruin me." His confession silenced the room. My voice came out low. "Who, Mark? Who was going to ruin you?" He pressed both hands to his temples, rocking slightly. People I owe. People who don't forgive. I thought if I could just fix it, if I could just get something from him pointing at me, then everything would be fine. George sank heavily into his chair, his face ashen. Linda sobbed into her hands. Emily shook her head, whispering, "You would have killed my father." Mark's eyes were wild now. I wasn't going to let it get that far. I just needed leverage. I just needed time. But no one believed him anymore. His words hung empty, falling into the heavy silence. Nathan slipped the packet into his jacket pocket, his voice firm. "This ends tonight." Mark looked around the room, his gaze landing on each of us, and for the first time, I saw fear overtake the anger. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder, carried by the cold winter air through the cracks in the windows. And in that moment, with red and blue lights flickering faintly against the snow outside, the weight of the night pressed down harder than ever. The knock at the door was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the murmurs that had filled the room. No one moved at first. Emily sat frozen in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes red and swollen. George rose slowly, his shoulders heavy, and made his way to the door. When he opened it, the cold air swept in, along with the light from the patrol car, red and blue shadows dancing across the snowbank outside. Sheriff Collins stepped inside, his hat in his hand, his boots leaving wet tracks on the entry rug. Behind him stood another deputy, younger eyes scanning the room quickly before settling on Mark. The sheriff's voice was calm, but carried the weight of authority. "We received a call about a disturbance." He glanced at Nathan, who nodded and produced the crumpled packet from his pocket. "It belongs to him," Nathan said firmly. Mark's chest rose and fell in quick bursts. He tried to laugh, tried to wave it off. "This is ridiculous. That is nothing. They are trying to set me up." Sheriff Collins studied him carefully, then looked to me. "What happened here tonight, Richard?" I swallowed hard, the weight of the evening pressing against my ribs. "He tried to poison me," I said quietly. "He put that powder in my drink. If I had not seen it, George would have been the one to lift that glass." Emily's voice cracked as she stood. "I saw it too." He leaned over the glass. I watched him. The sheriff's expression did not change, but he nodded once. He turned back to Mark. "You are going to have to come with us." Mark shook his head, backing up a step. "No, you don't understand. If I go with you, I'm finished." George's voice came from the corner, hollow and breaking. "You finished yourself tonight." The deputy stepped forward, pulling handcuffs from his belt. Mark's eyes darted wildly around the room, landing on each of us, as though begging someone to defend him. Linda sobbed quietly into her hands. Emily stood rigid, her body trembling. I stayed where I was, my jaw tight, my eyes never leaving him. When the cold metal closed around his wrists, the fight seemed to drain out of him. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed. They led him toward the door, and for a moment he turned his eyes, meeting Emily's. She flinched, but did not look away. Outside, the snow continued to fall in a steady hush. The car door slammed, the sirens faded into the distance, and the house was left in heavy silence. For a long time, no one spoke. George sank back into his chair, staring at the empty glass still glistening on the floor. Linda sat beside him, her sobs quieter now, more like the sound of something broken beyond repair. Emily moved slowly toward me, and when she reached me, she collapsed into my arms. I held her tightly, feeling her shoulders shake. "You are safe," I whispered, though I knew the scars of this night would linger. She pressed her face against my chest, her voice muffled. "I thought I knew him." I brushed her hair back gently. "You did not fail Emily. He chose this path, not you." Martha and Frank began quietly gathering the children, soothing their frightened questions, leading them back upstairs. Dr. Hill and Nathan worked together to sweep the shards of glass into a small pile, restoring some order to the room. Slowly, the house shifted back from chaos into something quieter, though the weight of what had happened would never fully leave. Later, after the guests had gone, and the children had finally fallen asleep, Emily and I sat by the fire. The flames were low, the embers glowing. She held a blanket around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the tree, the ornaments shimmering softly. I broke the silence. Christmas was never meant to be like this. She gave a small, weary smile. But at least we know the truth now. I nodded, staring into the embers. Sometimes the truth burns before it heals, but it sets us free. George and Linda left quietly, not long after, their faces etched with grief. George shook my hand firmly, his grip lingering as if to apologize for a burden his son had placed on us all. Linda could not meet my eyes, but I saw the devastation written across her face. When the house finally settled into silence, I stood and adjusted the stockings on the mantel. My wife's old needlework still neat and strong after so many years. I thought of her then, how she would have fought for Emily with the same ferocity I had tonight, how she would have steadied me in the moments when my voice shook. The snow outside glowed under the porch light, soft and untouched. I walked to the window and pressed my hand against the cold glass, breathing slowly. Justice had come, though not in the way any of us would have chosen. The night had been scarred, but it was not lost. Emily and the children would wake tomorrow, knowing that danger had passed, that truth had won out in the end. I turned back to the fire where Emily dozed lightly on the couch, her face peaceful for the first time in weeks. I tucked the blanket closer around her and sat down again, letting the warmth of the embers wash over me. Sometimes revenge is not a scream or a fight. Sometimes it is standing in the middle of the storm and refusing to bend, letting the truth speak louder than the lies. Tonight the lies had shattered like that glass on the floor, and though our hearts were bruised, we were still standing. If you have listened this far, I want to thank you for staying with me through every turn of this night. Share your thoughts with me. Tell me what struck you most, and let me know if stories like this reach you the way they reach me. Stay close, because there are more truths to uncover, more families to hear from, and more voices that deserve to be remembered.